Welcome or welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Never Ending Travel Bucket List, which is where I will go over everything to do with traveling, from travel itineraries to travel guides, travel tips, and more. So if you are a traveler or want to become a traveler in the future, follow along because we will go over everything on this channel. For today's video, we are going to be talking about everything that I wish I knew before traveling to Japan. So I was just recently in Japan this past July, and I was traveling Japan for 2 weeks. And let me just say, there was a lot of things that I learned during this trip that I wish I knew before, or things that I went into knowing and was so grateful that I did. So I wanted to share them with you in case you are also planning a trip to Japan soon. In this video, we'll be going over everything that I wish I knew for packing, for transport, for accommodations, and just like places to go. Oh, and food. So the first thing I want to talk about is packing. So before you even leave on your trip, these are the things that I realized during the packing process. So the first thing I recommend is pack more conservative clothes. You are going to be traveling Japan. It might be summer. It might be incredibly hot. When I went, it was almost 40 degrees, okay? I was sweating, but I was so grateful that I packed longer dresses that covered my knees or something to wear over my shoulders, because in Japan culture, they just dress more conservatively in their day-to-day lives. So it's not really like a strict rule like a lot of places in Asia where you have to cover your shoulders and cover your knees for going to temples and things like that, which you do when you're there. But just in day-to-day life, walking down the street, I felt better when I was covered up a bit more. I felt a little bit out of place. I felt like I might have been offending some people, which might have not been the case, but for myself, just being able to see how other people dressed, I wanted to kind of respect their culture and do the same. So the fact that I was packing for a 3-month trip, I was very grateful that I packed a few more conservative clothing items to bring with me for the portion of Japan, because the other places on my trip didn't really have the same situation. I traveled to Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. They were a bit different. Temples over there, you definitely want to cover up, but day to day wasn't as big of a deal. But Japan, definitely, I would recommend bringing a few more items that cover your shoulders and cover your knees. Just be respectful. The second thing I want to say about packing, if you are traveling on a budget airline like myself, I traveled with Zip Air, which I highly recommend for all my budget travelers out there. It was great. We were able to get round-trip flights from Vancouver, Canada to Tokyo, Japan for under $1,000, which I don't know about you guys, but for me, flights from Vancouver are normally pretty expensive. So that was a good deal for me. But you don't get a whole lot included, which means you have to pack very light, because the only thing that's included in your ticket for Zip Air was a 7-kilogram bag, which, in case anyone's wondering, 7 kilograms isn't a whole lot of weight, which I realized while packing for my trip. So I have a 40-liter backpack. I have the 40-liter Osprey Fairview backpack, and I love it. Super tiny, easy to pack on my back. So I was like, if I filled that up, I should be good. Little did I know that I was gonna be almost double the weight. So try to pack light so you can travel on budget airlines to save some money. That's my second tip for packing. The second thing I'm going to go over for things you should know before going to Japan is to do with transport. So as I already talked about before, if you're looking for flights, I definitely recommend looking on Google Flights and looking into Zip Air. It's one of Japan's budget airlines, and they most likely will be at an airport where you live. So I recommend, if you're looking for cheaper flights, definitely check out Zip Air. But as I mentioned before, the only reason why it's so affordable is because there's not a whole lot included. Like baggage, as I mentioned before, In-flight meals you do not get, so keep that in mind. We had to buy things before we got on the flight, so we were not starving on our 9-hour flight from Vancouver to Tokyo. And like seat selection, that's not included. So if you're okay like me to kind of rough it on a flight, don't really care where I sit, I can get my own food, I can bring it on with me, don't really care about that, and I can try and pack light, definitely recommend checking out Zip Air to save some money, as well as trains and transport within Japan. I have a few tips about that. So my first tip, if you're looking up traveling to Japan, you most likely have heard people say you need to get the JR Rail Pass, and I'd just like to say it's not necessary. I feel like all the different blog posts that I read or videos that I watched, everyone was like, you need to get this pass. You don't. I saved more money just booking all my bullet trains individually than getting the pass. So I definitely recommend, if you have a itinerary that you know you're gonna want to do and you know the places you want to see, check out the bullet trains just separately without the JR pass and see if it's cheaper, because for my situation it was. We went to 5 different places in Japan. We started in Tokyo, went to Kyoto, Hiroshima, Osaka, and Hakone, and then back to Tokyo, and we took bullet trains between all of those places, and it was cheaper than what it would be if we got the JR pass. So keep that in mind. Don't listen to all the things out there that say you need it. It's the same as like the Eurorail pass in Europe. It can be helpful for some situations, but sometimes it's just cheaper to get your individual train passes. Anywho, moving on, still talking about trains. When people say to get to the train station early, I highly recommend you listen, because we had so many situations. We took bullet trains throughout all those places that I just mentioned. We took 6 trains, and the amount of times, not only the first time did we get lost or didn't know what we were doing or couldn't get our tickets, it happened multiple times. So I highly recommend you get there early, minimum 30 minutes. I even recommend maybe an hour. There was sometimes that I was so grateful we were an hour early because we couldn't scan our QR code to get our actual tickets. We couldn't find the platform we're supposed to be on. These train stations are huge sometimes and can be a little overwhelming. I remember our first bullet train that we took, we scoped out the train station the night before because we were worried about even getting there. We got there and we had to ask, I think, 5 workers before we got our tickets and got to our bullet train platform. So people in Japan are super nice, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Almost everyone is willing to help you out. But those are my few tips about taking trains in Japan. Okay, now all about accommodations. So I only have really one tip about accommodations, and that is about hostels. So if you're like me and are a budget traveler, hostels are going to be the way that you want to travel around the world. But hostels are very different depending on the places you go. And in Japan, they are not as social as a lot of other places around the world. Say places in Europe or places in Southeast Asia like Vietnam and Thailand are a lot more social, a lot more party vibes most of the time, whereas Japan isn't really that situation. So I don't want to deter you from taking the budget route. I definitely recommend checking out hostels in Japan. They were great. We stayed in hostels for almost everywhere we went, and they were fine. But I do want to just say a disclaimer that they're not as social as a lot of places or a lot of hostels, as well as they're not all just young people. We met a lot of other travelers that were a bit older, as well as a lot of locals that were just traveling around Japan. So just so you know, that's a bit more the vibe of hostels in Japan. And before we get to the end of this video, I just wanted to go over a few things to do with food and a few things about places to visit while you're in Japan. So for food, I know if you are a Japanese food lover like myself, you are probably very excited about the sushi. And don't get me wrong, it was amazing, but I recommend you try other things besides just sushi. I will admit, when I went to Japan, the only really Japanese food that I knew was sushi. But they have amazing food that I definitely recommend you try it out. I'll put a list up here, some of the names of the dishes that I recommend you try, but just put yourself outside your comfort zone. Don't just stick with sushi, but definitely check that out as well while you're in Japan. And last thing I want to touch on, if you are going to Japan and only have 2 weeks like myself, I definitely recommend the route that I took. I spent only 1 day starting off my trip in Tokyo because that's where I flew in. And then I went straight to Kyoto. I spent around 3 days in Kyoto visiting all the different places, like the shrines, the bamboo forest, of course, different palaces and things like that. There's so many things to see in Kyoto. Second place I went to, well, third technically, was Hiroshima. And Hiroshima, of course, is very history heavy. I definitely recommend you go see the Peace Memorial Museum and learn about all of the history in Hiroshima. I spent 1 full day in Hiroshima and then 1 day day trip to Ejima, and then we went to Osaka, which is kind of like the food capital of Japan, I would say. They have amazing food. They have the Downtown Street, which is just like you see in photos. It was amazing. And then we went to Hakone, which normally you will see views of Mount Fuji. Unfortunately, when we went, it was super foggy, super rainy, was not the best weather, but there's so many things to do there anyways. We went on the cruise across Lake Ashi. We went up the ropeway, went on the trains. It was beautiful there, even if we really couldn't see a whole lot. And then we ended off in Tokyo for a few more days before we flew home, or flew to our next destination actually. So that is everything that I was grateful I knew before going on my trip to Japan, or I wish I knew. I hope that helps for anyone planning a trip to Japan. Just make sure you know a bit about the culture and customs. Just try to be respectful. I know for myself, I kind of learned a few things along the way, and yeah, I hope you have an amazing trip to Japan if you're going, and follow along for many more travel videos to come.